Hello and welcome to a new episode of our weekly show, Global Insight. I'm your host, Dr.Youness. After the accusation of being behind the last year's bomb attack in the Black Sea resort of Burgas in Bulgaria, the 28-nation bloc unanimously agreed to put Hezbollah's military wing on the EU blacklist on the 22nd of June. Many of the Lebanese elite officials have denounced the move and urged the EU to annul the decision, while Hezbollah's community assured that such unjust decision will not influence their determination. However, the underlying reason for such decision are still ambiguous and is being highly debatable. What are the legal repercussions of such decision? Will it have an influence on the Lebanese already chaotic politics? Is there a distinction between the military wing and the political wing of Hezbollah? Deep insights about these questions, among many others, will be explored with our guest in the studio, Dr. Amal Saad-Grayeb. Dr. Amal Saad-Grayeb, you are a university professor and an author of a book on Hezbollah. I highly thank you for your appearance in today's show, and we will be joined from Italy with a phone intervention with Dr. Hamze Jammoul, who is a researcher in conflict resolution. Before shedding lights on the many questions of this episode, we will start with the report and we'll be back.
On the 22nd of June, the 28-nation European Union unanimously agreed to put Hezbollah's military wing on its blacklist. A number of European governments accused Hezbollah of being behind last year's bomb attack in the Black Sea resort of Burgas in Bulgaria, which killed 5 Israeli tourists and 1 Bulgarian. The blacklisting would mean imposing visa bans on individuals and asset freezes on organizations associated with the group. Hezbollah has definitely rejected the allegation, in which several EU nations have also pointed to the movements fighting against foreign-backed Takfiri groups in Syria as the main reason behind the decision. Hezbollah considered the move as aggressive and unjust. In his first speech after the decision, Hezbollah's leader Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah slammed the EU move, saying the European Union had bowed to Israeli and US pressure. He directly addressed the European countries, saying that the decision was an insult to the Europeans themselves. Sayyid Nasrallah implied that Europe was moving closer to the US stance regarding its favoritism towards Israel. He criticized the EU for blacklisting a resistance movement, while at the same time turning a blind eye to Israeli occupation and crimes. He added that in case of any future Israeli aggression on Lebanon, Europe would be considered a partner in the crime. Lebanese caretaker State Minister Mohammed Ifneish said that an EU decision to designate Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization will complicate the formation of the upcoming cabinet, because the 14th of March coalition will use it to support its stance of opposing Hezbollah's participation in the government. Ifneish conveyed to the EU ambassador to Lebanon, Angelina Eckharst, his party's belief that the decision to blacklist Hezbollah would give Israel license to target Lebanon. However, the EU officials said the decision would only target the Jihadist Council and Foreign Security Committee of Hezbollah, reiterating that the EU did not object Hezbollah's governmental participation. Yet Hezbollah's stance stated that the EU cannot condemn with one hand and then extend the other to shake ours. Many commentators consider that the EU's step could be put within the context of an extension of the war on Syria. Hezbollah's role in liberating Qusayr appears to have paved the way for more Syrian army successes, much to the dismay of some European states. Hence, the European stance towards Syria seems to be leading Europe to take pro-Israeli positions, certain to be unpopular amongst many of the regional nations who at one time viewed Europe as being more even-handed when it comes to the Middle East policies. Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu criticized why Hezbollah was not banned outright. Tehran, on its part, skirmished the European Union's blacklisting of Hezbollah's military wing, saying the move will have no bearing on the Lebanese resistance movement's influence in the region.
Hello again, Dr. Amal Saad-Grayeb. In fact, the distinction between terrorism and resistance has always been debatable. How can you make a distinction between these two terms, especially that these two terms are highly embedded in the people and nations' philosophy, in their experience, in their culture, in their social fabric as well? So there is subjectivity usually in these definitions. How can you make a distinction between these two terms?
I think these terms have now become really value judgments, rather than scientific terms or political science terms that are used. Basically, whatever or whoever executes any kind of political violence, say, even if it's resistance, if that side is considered an enemy of the United States and its interests, and Israel, of course, then it's branded terrorism. If, on the other hand, that there is political violence, again, that is practiced maybe against civilian targets, and that side happens to support the US, then that is not considered terrorism. And we see this, for example, these double standards being practiced in Syria, for instance, where you have obviously al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and naturally the US does consider them terrorists because they have attacked US interests, but you have so-called secular, for example, groups in Syria, militant groups, and they are called, I've seen this actually often, they're called resistance. They're now actually usurping the resistance axis terminology in Western media and applying it to Syrian groups.
So the subjectivity and the lack of a scientific approach to defining these terms leads to these double standards. And in your opinion, this led to enlisting or to the accusation of Hezbollah of what has happened in Bulgaria and blacklisting the military wing of Hezbollah according to the European Union?
Well, I mean, obviously it facilitates that kind of blacklisting because even the United Nations doesn't have an agreed upon definition of what constitutes terrorism. It's only single countries which have definitions, and even those definitions, for example, the US, inside the US, there are various definitions in various government agencies, like the Pentagon has one, the State Department has one, and if you read, between the lines, they're tailor-made to suit US interests. So, of course, this does facilitate such branding. I don't think the EU has one definition, actually.
But in fact, the voting for blacklisting Hezbollah was unanimous. The 28 nations bloc has voted unanimously about this. You've mentioned the word tailor-made. So, do you think that this voting was tailor-made, was customized to suit to be in compliance with the US interests?
Well, obviously, EU states had been pressured for many years now. This is nothing new. It's been going on for many years. It's very timely, I think, that this decision was taken right after the fall of Qusayr, after Hezbollah and the Syrian government liberated Qusayr from Takfiri jihadis. And this was seen as a major threat to US Gulf Arab interests.
But those Takfiri jihadis are also a major threat to the European Union countries and to the US as well. Even many of the European Union citizens who came to Syria to support the resistances, they have been radicalized in Syria and then sent back to their countries, and they are a threat in their countries.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
what a dilemma as well.
It's really a very absurd situation, because these very groups, the EU has lifted its arms embargo on Takfiri groups, which it considers terrorism. And these groups, of course, are a threat to EU countries' homeland security, whereas groups like Hezbollah, Palestinian militants, Syria, for example, they are not threats, they never have been threats to EU security. They are, yes, threats to EU and American interests in our region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, yes. They are a threat to European and Western hegemony in our region, but not a threat to its security. And this is why it is a really absurd situation that Hezbollah is being branded a terrorist group, when it's actually, there is no evidence whatsoever that Hezbollah has engaged in any kind of terrorism on EU territory. Even the Burgas bombing itself, there is no decisive verdict. I mean, the Bulgarians did not convict Hezbollah.
There have been some reports that Al-Qaeda was involved in such, was highly accused in the explosion of, or the bomb attack which has taken place in the Black Sea of Burgas. Why wasn't it that apparent, or why wasn't it revealed in public, in the media?
That's right. These reports surfaced in Bulgarian media, and they were silenced. and they were dismissed by the US because of the ongoing pressure on
But
Bulgaria.
were there evidences about the involvement of Al-Qaeda?
There was indeed evidence that Al-Qaeda linked elements were responsible for the attack, and we even have one Al-Qaeda official, I forget his name now, who basically came out and supported the act and defended publicly
but it was muted later.
It was muted, exactly, and I don't think the investigation continued along that path. And what we saw basically was in the initial phases, there was immense Israeli pressure on the Bulgarian government to accuse Hezbollah, and then later when the government changed hands, for example, on June 5th, 2013, the day Qusair fell, before any of its implications were apparent, we had the Bulgarian foreign minister, who was part of the before that he was part of the opposition. He came out and said there is no evidence linking this attack to Hezbollah. 2 weeks later, exactly, the interior minister comes out and says there is, sufficient evidence to implicate Hezbollah. And of course, they never did come out with a final verdict. What we have now is...
And were there certain evidences revealed to the public? Are there certain evidences which accuse Hezbollah actually, something material?
I haven't really been following the details of this, alleged evidence.
Because you think that regardless of the details, Hezbollah was to be accused anyway.
Exactly. I really don't see that. We have names, and what's really ridiculous, I think, is that you have so-called, Hezbollah militants, they call them, or whatever. There is no, I don't think that if Hezbollah were to ever execute any kind of political violence abroad, that they would reveal their members to the public, and I don't see how these individuals...
And history of Hezbollah has shown that that once they get involved in any war, in any they reveal those
exactly
those
they reveal
members.
the identities. There is no way European countries' intelligence services have access to that kind of information, and that these individuals are indeed part of Hezbollah's security apparatus. I don't think they can have that. So we have names of two people who are allegedly linked to Hezbollah. How, they managed to link these two individuals to Hezbollah in an organizational sense, which is obviously, Hezbollah's, especially its military wing, is a very clandestine organization. There is no way they are privy to that kind of information. And this is why I said I dismiss this kind of evidence.
And they have proven that they are highly clandestine in this sense. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's very clear that, what they're calling now, what the EU, the terminology they're using is, a justifiable conclusion, they're saying. That's not even a legal term. Based on a justifiable conclusion, to the Bulgarian bombing, they have decided to brand Hezbollah, blacklist Hezbollah as terrorists. So it's not even a legal
But can a justifiable conclusion, which is not that legal, trigger the consensus of the 28 nations bloc European Union, whose policy is characterized by ambiguity and by segregation?
I didn't understand.
You said that that the decision was based on a justifiable conclusion, and it's not something, it's not legalized. So can a justifiable conclusion lead to the consensus amongst the members of the European Union?
Well, obviously it can, because it's a political decision. It's not a legal one, and it is not based on any kind of. It's not based on legal grounds. They are purely political grounds, and I think that there was a lot of pressure on the EU to basically use the outcome, the political outcome, it's not even a judicial outcome of the Bulgarian investigation, as a pretext with which it could blacklist Hezbollah. And we know full well now, details are emerging of the kind of, the debate within the EU, that there is no consensus actually. Yes, the decision emerged as a result of unanimous voting, but nonetheless, there were many members of the EU, even France initially, who were reluctant to blacklist Hezbollah. It was mainly pushed by Britain, obviously on the behalf of the United States and Israel, and later the other countries were kind of forced to comply, I think. But nonetheless, the very fact that the EU has made a distinction between the political and military wings of Hezbollah, which hasn't been done in the case of other groups blacklisted as terrorists by the EU, indicates that the EU is very uncomfortable, I think, with this position. At least some of its members are, and it is looking for a way out, if you like an exit strategy, in order to continue dialogue with Hezbollah. it's very difficult for the EU, which
but
has
dialogue
interest.
was there, and it was being established before this decision has taken place, and it continued apparently. So, in your opinion, other than the Hezbollah's involvement in Syria, the fall of Qusayr, and the defeat of Syrian rebels, what are the main underlying reasons for such blacklisting?
Well, there's the trigger, I would say. The trigger was the fall of Qusayr, definitely. But, you know, as Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah himself indicated in his latest speech, I mean, this has been part of an ongoing American-Israeli campaign and pressure on the EU to delegitimize Hezbollah in the region. I mean, obviously, the effect of this, I wouldn't exaggerate it. It's not catastrophic for Hezbollah, but it is obviously a very bad PR. It will have a negative.
We'll talk about
yes.
the brand equity of Hezbollah, whether it
Yes.
will be influenced by this decision or not, but right after the break. A break, and we'll be back.
Beyond the lines, beyond the surface. Depth, clarity, substance. Beyond the discourse.
Beyond politics, beyond the shallowness of everyday politics.
Hello again to Global Insight. In fact, before the break, you were mentioning that one of the underlying reasons for blacklisting Hezbollah is to delegitimize Hezbollah, as Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah as well has said. However, the political wing of Hezbollah wasn't blacklisted, and what gives legitimacy to a certain political party is its involvement in the political life of a certain country. So, isn't that paradoxical or contradictory?
Well, yes, of course it is, because on the one hand, I mean, this is the distinction between the military and political wings was obviously a British innovation. And however, in this specific case, I think that EU member states wanted to continue because they do recognize Hezbollah as a legitimate political player. There is no denying that Hezbollah represents the overwhelming majority, and I'm talking here above 90%, of Shia public opinion in Lebanon. And there is no way that EU member states could ignore that. There is no other group or political party that they can, hold to account, for example. I mean, Hezbollah is a politically accountable group, and its participation in the political system, of course, which is recognized by the Lebanese state and recognized by the Lebanese army, which is very interesting. I mean, later on we can discuss, what the implications are for example, UNIFIL, when the Lebanese army, part of the Lebanese state, recognizes Hezbollah, considers it a partner, a national partner, for example. So this is a group which has, is obviously granted national legitimacy, not only popular, but also, I would say...
It's part of the social fabric of the Lebanese.
It's obviously part of the social fabric, but it also enjoys, other than popular legitimacy, state legitimacy. And therefore, the EU, cannot circumvent that. It is very aware of that. So therefore, what we have is this clause whereby they can continue engaging with Hezbollah, and they have said, their officials and representatives have said repeatedly they're not going to veto anyone's participation in the Lebanese upcoming cabinet, and that they're going to continue a dialogue with all parties. And in fact, they have. They've been speaking to Hezbollah officials immediately, afterwards. So they're clearly, I think this is some kind of damage control, if you like, on the part of the EU, which is still very wary of its decision. It's clearly uncomfortable.
But it's not infinite, so it might be reversible as...
they said it could be reversible in 6 months. And then, of course, we still have to await Sweden. I mean, if the Swedish parliament doesn't ratify this, then obviously there will be no, terrorist blacklisting. We still have to await and see, where this is going to...
Yeah. Okay, you've mentioned as well that it influences the brand equity or the PR of Hezbollah, the public relations. In what sense?
Well, I think, first of all, let's be very realistic here. Hezbollah has suffered a loss of popularity in the aftermath of the war on Syria. especially because of Hezbollah's participation in the war.
Lack of popularity amongst whom?
Amongst Arabs. Amongst
Arabs,
Arabs in the region, I would say. I mean, it's lost some support, maybe significant support.
Was it there after 2006?
It was definitely at an all-time high. There were opinion polls published by American experts and think tanks, and this, they basically revealed that Hezbollah's support skyrocketed after the 2006 war. And obviously after 2011, when Hezbollah was vocally supporting the Assad government, Hezbollah's support began to decline in the Arab world. So I think on the one hand, this move is designed to sort of further reduce that support for Hezbollah. Now, I think the problem...
Does the Arab public opinion gets influenced by
exactly. This is what I want to say. I think it's going to have obviously more impact in Europe and the West than in the Arab world, which, I mean, if anything, being branded terrorist by the West is usually considered a badge of honor, not a social stigma. So I think it's going to have, ramifications mainly in the West. And of course, the Western public has always viewed Hezbollah as a terrorist movement in the first place because of, the mainstream media coverage of the movement. But also, I think the other intended effect is not so much to delegitimize, but to also reduce support for Hezbollah among the Shia community, especially Shia living in the West, especially in terms of, for example, say financial support for the resistance, other forms of support. This would perhaps make some people more wary of lending any kind of support to the movement.
More hesitant, actually. Yeah.
Exactly, they're going to be much more, well, supposedly, I think the intent is to make them more cautious. And I think also what it does do is, it's an attempt to kind of equalize Hezbollah or render it a kind of equivalent to Al-Qaeda. I mean, Al-Qaeda is terrorist, and yes, everyone knows.
So they want to create this perceived image.
Exactly. Obviously that the Syrian opposition, because it's now become common knowledge, is in Syria, rebel groups are overwhelmingly Al-Qaeda affiliates, and the West now knows this. It's a fact. They can't run away from it. So by branding Hezbollah terrorists, then it kind of lends
there will
some
be a correlation between these
exactly,
two terms.
Yes.
Yeah, I've highlighted one of your statements in which you've said, "I can't think of a more irrational and ultimately self-destructive national security strategy than one which brands a popular grassroots resistance movement which is firmly rooted in an entire community as a terrorist organization." How can you elaborate on this?
Yes. Well, what I was saying is, with Hezbollah, there is, and Hezbollah officials have said this repeatedly, there is no distinction between a military and a political wing. First of all, even Hezbollah itself as a movement does not fit into the Western prototype of what constitutes a party. There are no card-carrying members of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a grassroots movement. It's very well rooted in the Shia community of Lebanon, and of course it has supporters from other sects in Lebanon. But basically,
they have alliances with many Lebanese parties which are not Muslim as well.
It cuts across sects, but we're talking here about basically because it's a Shia Islamic movement. Therefore, it draws its ranks, especially its military ranks, from the Shia community, from devout Shia, not obviously secular Shia necessarily, although they support it. So it's a grassroots movement, and even as a party, therefore, we can't consider Hezbollah some kind of isolated political cell or some kind of isolated military organizational entity. It is a popular movement. It draws its support from all layers of Shia society in Lebanon. It cuts across social class, across regions, and as many people have now noted, obviously not necessarily experts, people know now that Hezbollah's foot soldiers come from all over Lebanon. Yeah. And these mujahideen can be basically mobilized at a moment's notice, and they'll have other jobs during the day. So in the first place, Hezbollah is not some kind of organizational nucleus that is detached from the Shia community of Lebanon. And therefore, because there are so many links, I mean, virtually every family in the south, in the Bekaa, has a member who is a fighter or a martyr. Again here, these people identify themselves as Hezbollah. They say, "I am Hezbollah." Does that mean they have a position?
And they support and coverage from Hezbollah.
Exactly. They receive social services.
And they have their voice heard via Hezbollah.
Exactly. And they're considered part of the resistance culture. Not necessarily just the Hezbollah community. It's a resistance culture, and it encompasses all these people. So if all these people then are going to be considered, I mean, exactly, what is the EU how is it going to deal with people like this? They all have links in one way or another, financial or social or political. with Hezbollah's military wing, which in the first place we were saying that Hezbollah is not merely a political party with a military wing, it is a resistance movement with a political wing. And therefore we cannot equate it with groups like Sinn Féin, for instance, in Northern Ireland, which, I mean, they had a political wing and a military wing, the IRA. It is not the same.
It is a military movement with political wing and not vice versa.
Exactly. Hezbollah's political participation actually came much later. It was a resistance movement.
And later they have become politically involved.
And they only became politically involved to protect the resistance. That is the main purpose of Hezbollah's political participation.
But can this definition be reversed nowadays after many of the underlying reasons for their military involvement in Lebanon have been vanished after the liberation of of many villages in the south, and after having fulfilled the duty, shouldn't they now be perceived as a political movement with a military wing? I'm asking you this question because I know that you've written a book about Hezbollah. One of the main references about Hezbollah is a book that you've written. So can this definition be reversed?
I don't think it can be. If
you can never perceive Hezbollah as a political movement with a military wing?
Hezbollah's political performance from 1992 onwards has always been one which has subordinated its political role to its military priority, to its resistance priority. Hezbollah actually doesn't really have a very solid political program or a coherent one. Its main focus is strategic issues related to the region, at the top of which obviously is the Zionist entity. Therefore, what I'm saying here is that Hezbollah has always actually sacrificed a lot of political achievements and positions it could have won. First, with the Syrian presence in Lebanon, Hezbollah was always compelled to forge alliances with the Amal movement to please Syria, and it did that. It lost seats in parliament in order to protect its resistance, to lend it cover. Later on, after 2005, Hezbollah only then participated in the executive branch of government. It waited until then. It never showed any interest in executive positions or in carving out a larger political role for the Shia community of Lebanon. All it was interested in was protecting the resistance, which it had to do after the Syrian withdrawal from Lebanon in 2005. And that's why I say Hezbollah is primarily a resistance movement, a military movement, which has a political, administrative, if you like, appendage to it, which is the party. But that party, even that party itself, there are no members of Hezbollah who do not perform some military service or receive military training. You know, that's something we also have to take account of. All members of Hezbollah have, at one point or another, served in the resistance, including Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah himself.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the implications of this decision. What might these implications be?
Well, I think it's being, I mean, the decision itself is not one which will really, you know, transform the political scene in Lebanon. There's a lot of talk of destabilizing Lebanon. Destabilizing
and postponing the formation of the Lebanese cabinet as well. As the minister in the Lebanese government said, Mr. Fneish. So do you think that it will contribute to delaying the formation of the Lebanese cabinet? Maybe some members of the 14th of March might not agree to be in the same cabinet with terrorists.
Yes. Well, I don't think they really have any choice here, obviously. Hezbollah is the strongest military movement, not only in Lebanon, but in much of the region as well. It's a major regional player now. You know, we're talking here about groups which can really do very little to confront Hezbollah except verbally. And at the end of the day, they will have no choice but to participate in a government which not only represents Hezbollah, but represents an entire community as well. I think that the point about destabilization is often overstated. I mean, yes, it will destabilize, just as the tribunal for Lebanon, for example, the UN tribunal destabilized Lebanon.
But later everything
went back. Yeah, I mean, even Hezbollah just completely ignored the whole process, which was clearly flawed from the outset. It was a kangaroo court, really. And this is yet another kangaroo court, another listing or branding which emerges from such a kind of kangaroo court process. And I think Hezbollah will again, and its supporters will completely dismiss that. So I think March 14 will have no choice but to later on accept this new reality, and the fact that the EU officials are meeting with Hezbollah ministers already.
Yeah, I mean, it's very weird, but maybe they are meeting with the political wing of
exactly.
Hezbollah.
I mean, they're meeting with the political
they
wing.
are making a distinction which you're not seeing, and many observers can see this distinction. What other implications can we talk about? For example, the relation with the UNIFIL, which is a very sensitive issue. Actually,
I think this is, you know, sort of the main problem area and one of the main ramifications which we have yet to see how this is going to play out on the ground. I personally think it's going to be very problematic now for UNIFIL to execute its mandate in Lebanon. I mean, what are its rules of engagement going to be now? Its main purpose, really, its job, its function, is to, first of all, observe, you know, Hezbollah areas, military zones, if you like, for weapons and so on, to liaise with Hezbollah's military officials. And I know that even before 2006, Hezbollah's military commanders enjoyed very good relations with UNIFIL, actually. And even the local population had good relations with UNIFIL. After 2006, that re-emerged, that same kind of relationship re-emerged. And we also, of course, have now the Lebanese army deployed alongside UNIFIL in these areas. The Lebanese army, as we said, recognizes Hezbollah as a resistance movement. UNIFIL, you know, if we look at UN Resolution 1701, recognizes Hezbollah. It does not brand Hezbollah a terrorist.
And even the EU demands the help of this resistance in the south to protect the European troops in South Lebanon on one hand, and then labels this movement as a terror on the other hand. So,
well, this is going to complicate things very much for EU contingents who are, you know, members of UNIFIL, obviously, because now they're going to be, what are they going to do? Not talk to Hezbollah commanders because they're banned in their home countries. I mean, this is what I mean. It's going to be very difficult for them to execute their mission, to carry it out, when they're not allowed, when they're forbidden from, for example, liaising with such individuals. And what do they do if they meet with a Hezbollah commander, for instance? What, do they not recognize him? I mean, do they say, you know...
What do you anticipate from a legal perspective? Can you have an anticipation regarding this?
I think they're going to have to find ways of sidestepping this. I mean, they're going to have to come up with some kind of legal loophole. You know, I don't know which law is supreme here, whether it'll be UN law or EU law or, you know, the law of home countries.
Usually in such cases, which law is supreme? Not the law of the home countries.
I honestly don't know how this is. Perhaps they're going to have to reduce their forces, or perhaps exchange, you know, these EU, if they find that it's very difficult to carry on performing their duties as UNIFIL observers. And of course, let's not forget, one of the missions of UNIFIL is to provide humanitarian aid and support to the Shia community and other communities in the south. I don't, you know, also that relationship with Shia civilians and so on is going to be complicated. They're going to now view UNIFIL as the enemy, I think, especially the EU. I'm not saying they're going to carry out any acts of violence against them, but this will make the relationship very tense. And therefore, because we have all these considerations, because it's going to be difficult for them now to deal with Hezbollah legally, and there are no political officials, we're talking about military officials. This is who they liaise with and meet with. How are they going to carry on this? Maybe they're going to now...
Wasn't this concern considered when Hezbollah was decided to be blacklisted?
It must have been, and it must have been one of the reasons why...
From a cost-benefit analysis, wasn't it worth doing that?
I personally believe
we'll have your answer right after the break. A break, and we'll be back.
Wherever those are persecuted, that place we tackle case by case.
Cases where we believe that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Hello again to Global Insight. I'm glad to be joined from Italy with Dr. Hamze Jammoul, who is a researcher in conflict resolution. Hello, Dr. Hamze. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, hello.
Hello. I'm glad to have you in this episode as well. In fact, Dr. Amal Saad-Grayeb has described the blacklisting of Hezbollah as an irrational decision and ultimately self-destructive. How can you read this decision?
Yes, actually, before how to describe this decision, it's important to say that the EU decided decision to put Hezbollah military wing on its terrorism blacklist is have no serious reasons and is not based on any justifications and evidences. So EU has played a crucial role in Middle East, and now this role has been decreased. Why? Because there is a goal from this EU decision. In this sense, it's obvious to say that the decision is a result of the American and Israeli pressure on the EU, especially in this difficult moment in the economic crisis and the American military presence in Europe. I would like to highlight on some goals that I consider important behind the decision. One is that the decision aims to support the 14 March movement in its political conflict against Hezbollah, especially in their claims against Hezbollah for participation in the coming government.
So you're talking about the support of 14th of March, but some other observers and commentators say that the goal is more strategic than that. Are there other goals?
Yes, in fact, there are internal goals and international or regional goals. The strategic goals is due to Hezbollah role in Syria. If you notice, Mr. John Kerry and Ms. Ashton claimed some days before, they said that the Syria was an important factor behind the decision of this decision. So this decision is to press on Hezbollah to withdraw the fighters from Syria and take a distance from Bashar al-Assad. It's also to distract Hezbollah from the principal Arab-Muslim case, the Palestinian case, especially that this decision follows a decision to resume negotiation between Palestinians and Israelis. So in my opinion, to conclude this question, I say that all the current events in Middle East, such as the EU decision against Hezbollah, the Syrian conflict, the dramatic situation in Egypt and Tunisia, and also in Iraq, are all related to one unique issue, the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is a strategic goal behind the decision.
And you've repeatedly mentioned the U.S. influence in some other interviews in which you've appeared. So the U.S. influence and the Israeli influence were the triggers for such decision?
Yes, of course. The European decision to blacklist Hezbollah is a clear demonstration that European political decision, especially in Middle East, is completely influenced by the American. This is due actually to several reasons, such as a crucial role you've played in the Second World War, and also after the Cold War. I will suggest you a famous quote that Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, he said once when NATO was constituted that NATO was founded to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. So the constitution of the NATO and the political and economic and military assistance for Europe increased the American influence in Europe.
What might the legal implications be, especially in the relation with the UNIFIL?
Actually, as I said before, the EU decision is a symbolic decision, and a political message to Hezbollah because of its role in Syrian conflict. This decision, in my opinion, will not have crucial impact neither in Lebanon nor in Europe. But one of the main results of this decision is that Europe is not anymore a neutral player in political affairs in Middle East. But which concerns the consequences on UNIFIL mission, there are more than legal consequences. We can speak about political. I don't think that it will affect the UNIFIL mission in South Lebanon because of the following reasons. First, Hezbollah's main role in South Lebanon is to defend Lebanon from any Israeli attack. Hezbollah is protecting UNIFIL in South Lebanon, and the peaceful nature of Lebanese and Hezbollah party prevent any negative effect against UNIFIL mission. Also, there is no interest for Hezbollah to escalate tension between Hezbollah and the UNIFIL. For example, you can notice that nothing changed in the south of Lebanon. The movement of the people in the villages south of Litani River is as it is on any day, and the UN convoys do their rounds normally every day. There is also another issue that will contribute in not affecting UNIFIL mission in Lebanon, is that UNIFIL mission is not a EU mission. It is a United Nations mission based on a Security Council resolution and not European resolution. As a conclusion, I think that Hezbollah will maintain its good relation with UNIFIL and will restrain their constituency in the south and prevent them from restoring to any violent acts against the United Interim Force in Lebanon.
And the final question is that do you think the blacklisting of Hezbollah will have an influence on the EU policy in the Middle East in general, or it will continue to be that flowing?
It's obvious. It's obvious, in my opinion, that the European role in Middle East, especially in Lebanon, will be affected. No, as I said before, Europe is not actually more than the neutral arbiter in Middle East conflicts. This decision, taking into consideration the German role as a neutral arbiter between Lebanon and Hezbollah, and also the historical role of Italy and French. Lebanon is also an important partner in the EU-Mediterranean partnership. Lebanon is also being embraced by the European neighborhood policy. So relations between the two parties, between Lebanon and EU and between Hezbollah and EU, should be improved. And the EU will not stop the economic assistance to Beirut, as EU ambassador said yesterday. So in my opinion, I will not be late, both parties, Hezbollah and Europe, need to improve the dialogue between each other, because we need to have a better mutual cooperation in the region and in the Middle East. We need a neutral Europe in the Middle East.
Dr. Hamze Jammoul, a researcher in conflict resolution, I highly thank you for your insights in this episode.
Thank you.
Before Dr. Hamza's call and before the break, we were approaching this decision from a cost-benefit analysis, or from utilitarian approach, if you want. From this approach, do you think that it was worth taking such a decision, blacklisting of Hezbollah's military wing?
I personally think it's a highly irrational one, and that the costs far outweigh any perceived advantages of such a decision.
Irrational from your perspective, but if you were in the shoes of the Europeans themselves.
Yes, I am speaking from a Western mind, of course,
okay,
yes,
because
rationality is obviously relative here.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
from the perspective of an EU country which has interests in Lebanon, which has interests in the region, and which has to acknowledge that Hezbollah represents, a main Lebanese community in Lebanon. I'm not going to say the largest, but a sizable community in Lebanon. That Hezbollah has not, in fact, engaged in any kind of terrorist acts. I mean, there is no conclusive evidence whatsoever.
But let me give you another counter argument. One of the definitions of terrorism says that terrorism leads to a creation of an atmosphere of fear and alarm. And many Lebanese citizens, I'll not mention percentages here, say that Hezbollah contributes to the atmosphere of fear and alarm in Lebanon. So this correlates with the definition of terrorism according to them, and someone has mentioned it on the Facebook page of the TV show, which the viewers can like. So what do you think?
I think this could be applied to practically any political actor in Lebanon. I mean, and outside of Lebanon, of course, we can say that about, the Obama administration. It alarms many Americans as well. Does that render it terrorist in their eyes? I mean, this is obviously, I think, a rather absurd allegation. Hezbollah, most definitions of terrorism have, actually, I would say all of them.
But the trigger of fear in Hezbollah's case is that they are militarily weaponed.
Yeah, I mean, they are armed.
Yeah.
Hezbollah might trigger fear. It does not, however, terrorize. I mean, the main, I think, common point, or rather common element in all the definitions of terrorism, which are obviously all very different, but one common element is to terrorize a population, even if force hasn't actually been practiced, just the very fact of scaring people. Hezbollah doesn't terrorize Lebanese. Yes, some Lebanese are afraid of Hezbollah's armed status, and these fears are being, sort of amped up by the future movement, by March 14 and so on. Yeah. But I don't think Hezbollah is seen as, a group which terrorizes Lebanese and is out to kill Lebanese civilians. I think that's really not warranted, that kind of definition. And actually, the EU did not brand Hezbollah a terrorist group on that basis. I mean, let's not say legal, but the quasi-legal justification for the blacklisting. First of all, as Dr. Jammoul himself said, EU officials have actually said Syria was one of the reasons. They've actually openly said this. I know the French foreign minister said this himself. And the second is the Bulgaria bombing. And neither of these have anything to do with Hezbollah's armed status inside Lebanon as a resistance movement, which is interesting. So the EU is not labeling Hezbollah a terrorist group because it's a resistance, but rather because of what is seen as acts outside, as Hezbollah terrorism outside of Lebanon. So this is an interesting distinction which kind of lends legitimacy to Hezbollah's resistance. And in fact, one EU official said yesterday that we distinguish between terrorism and resistance to occupation. And I think that was sort of meant, maybe, in my opinion, I think, which could perhaps give some leeway for UNIFIL, for EU contingents of UNIFIL, to deal with Hezbollah militants in a different capacity. Perhaps that's the kind of legal loophole we'll find, or political loophole. Well, we're dealing with resistance, not with Hezbollah's external security organization, as Britain labels it.
Yeah. In fact, Dr. Hamze Jammoul has undermined the impact of blacklisting of Hezbollah. But many people are concerned, and many commentators are concerned about the implications of this decision. And one of the likers of the Facebook page is worried about his opportunity of pursuing his studies, his PhD studies in Europe, for example, despite not being an affiliate, a Hezbollah affiliate. Maybe he has some family members who are Hezbollah affiliates. Might this have an implication that far?
Well, I think these sorts of concerns are very justified, because especially since we've seen this kind of, this kind of witch hunt, if you like, being practiced by the US authorities, American authorities, and by Gulf Arab states, which are basically expelling, just Shia, Shia people who work in those states, not on any kind of legal basis whatsoever. So there are fears that that kind of policy will be practiced in Europe. I personally don't think that European countries will go that far. I mean, there is some kind of rule of law. They're looking at, in Britain, you have al-Qaeda suspects, for example, in Britain only recently were extradited. I think, even in Britain, it's very hard for them to kind of twist, and distort all kinds of judicial procedures just to blacklist people living in Europe. I think it's going to be much harder, and there's much more rule of law, if you like, in European states than there is in the United States, and obviously there's absolutely none in Gulf Arab states. So I think these fears, while justified, perhaps might be a little bit overblown. And I don't think the EU is out to get everyone who supports Hezbollah. That would be ridiculous. They would have to basically clamp down on every single Shia Lebanese, on every single non-Shia Arab who supports Hezbollah in one way or another. It's going to be very difficult for them to do that. And I don't think they're going to take it that far.
One of the comments on the Facebook page was that considered that one of the underlying reasons for blacklisting Hezbollah is that they are trying to push Hezbollah for a bad reaction. Might Hezbollah be pushed for such a reaction?
Hezbollah,
or you rely on the wisdom of the leaders?
Of course, I mean, not only, of course, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah's wisdom, but Hezbollah as a political party, and of course it is a party as well as a resistance movement. It has a very, I think, rational approach to politics. It's very pragmatic. We saw it welcoming EU officials right after the blacklisting. And talk with them. Obviously, it does see this as an affront. It does see this as a very unwise decision, but it's going to continue. It's not in its interests to antagonize EU member states, obviously, just as it's not in their interests to completely alienate either Hezbollah or the Shia community of Lebanon. It's not in the EU's interest to do that. I think they're going to carry on with the dialogue, which has been ongoing for many years now. And I don't see how it's really going to complicate the relationship in the medium term or short term between Hezbollah and the EU. I don't think it's going to really reverberate that much in Lebanon. And in fact, one way of, I think, to corroborate this, we just need to look at the Israeli reaction, which is furious, which is outraged with the EU decition. They're very unhappy that they were not
want the political wing as well to be
which
blacklisted.
Means that it's considered, far short of what Israeli and American expectations were.
But maybe it's a gradual decision.
I don't think that there is, in my opinion,
there is no way.
There is no way they're going to also include the political wing. Definitely not. No.
In fact, you've said that one of the underlying reasons for the involvement of Hezbollah on that, for the blacklisting of Hezbollah, is their role in Syria. Will it influence the involvement of the potential involvement of Hezbollah in Syria?
Definitely not. Hezbollah's involvement in Syria is a very strategic decision. It's not going to be reversed by, I think, just sort of a PR stunt, really, which is essentially a PR stunt of blacklisting the movement in the West. Hezbollah's role in Syria is existential for the movement. It is seen as a war not only against Takfiris, but a war against Israel and American interests in the region, against the resistance, a role which protects Lebanon's minorities. I mean, there are so many elements which have contributed.
And many justifications.
And justifications. The rationale is multifaceted, but essentially it is a strategic decision, it's an existential one. And therefore Hezbollah cannot possibly withdraw from its role in Syria. The fall of the Assad government, I'm just imagining if the Assad government were to fall.
The implications.
I mean, the implications would be so dire for Hezbollah. Nothing as I think is just, insignificant really at the end of the day. Strategically, it is strategically insignificant. This decision, the EU decision, has no strategic ramifications really.
Okay. Dr. Amal Saad-Grayeb, a university professor and an author of a book on Hezbollah, I highly thank you for your deep insights in today's episode. And I'd like to thank Dr. Hamze Jammoul, who joined us from Italy via phone. He is a researcher in conflict resolution. In fact, the underlying reasons for this decision have been apparent. However, the implications cannot but be, we can't but wait and see to see the implications of this decision. Until then, I ask you to like the page, the Facebook page of our TV show, and stay tuned to Global Insight. Thank you.